Chapter 8, Field Operations, Part 3. And now in this last PowerPoint for the chapter, we discussed the investigative function. So we had the patrol function, and we discussed it really generally. Now, we did discuss it in part in some earlier chapters when we talked about, for instance, the Kansas City Patrol study and the earlier PowerPoints, and we will continue to discuss patrol from time to time when we talk about the daily operations of police. But let's turn our attention for now to the investigative function. So we said with police departments, generally speaking, they have two major functions. One is patrol and the other is investigation. And so if we examine the investigative function, some of the things we could say about it generally are that there are some key functions that investigators perform. So first of all, whether we're talking about detectives or patrol officers, anybody who's working as doing investigation, they have to determine whether a crime has been committed. So maybe there are situations when there hasn't been any crimes committed. We have a car accident and it's a minor fender bender. Nobody was criminally at fault. We're not going to declare this to be a crime. Now we may investigate it because that's one of the roles that we perform. We do traffic investigation to find out, who was at cause, but it's not for eventually a criminal, pointing us towards a criminal conviction, but it's for insurance purposes. Maybe we will ticket somebody if they were at fault, if they were recklessly driving or whatever it might be. But generally speaking, there's no crime committed. So one of the things we have to do as an investigator is, let's see what happened. When we have a death, it doesn't mean necessarily that there was foul play. If we have injuries, it doesn't mean necessarily that there was an assault. Any of these kinds of things. So was there a crime committed? That's one of the first functions of an investigator. Secondly, we may need to identify the perpetrator. Maybe they're still at the scene, they're right in front of us. Maybe we've even observed them commit the offense. But if we don't have that, then we need to identify who did it. So if we determine there is a need for further investigation, that there might have been a crime, okay, now we have to find out who did it if we don't know. If we have an idea of who did it, then obviously we have to apprehend them. So unless they're easily found, we're going to have to try to track them down if we want to actually apprehend them. Where did they go? They're hiding from the police. We have an all points bulletin out, an APB out for them to be on the lookout for this particular person. We have their picture up in the post office. All these kinds of things are on the FBI's most wanted list. So to apprehend the perpetrator, we may have to do some significant investigation. Think about all the investigation and intelligence work that went into eventually finding Osama bin Laden and other high-profile terrorists who had gone into hiding. So it could be the local criminal on the street, or we could be talking about an international terrorist that we're looking for. Finally, investigators may need to provide evidence to support a conviction in court. So they're going to have to, after we've apprehended the perpetrator, we determine there was a crime, we identify the perpetrator, we apprehend the perpetrator. Now we need to provide further evidence so that we can actually get a conviction for this perpetrator. So these are the four main functions of investigators: determining whether there was a crime, identifying perpetrators, apprehending perpetrators, and providing evidence to support criminal convictions, criminal prosecutions. What are the various phases of a typical investigation? Well, your book describes preliminary investigations. So a preliminary investigation is often done typically by the responding officer, who's usually a patrol officer. So the first officer on the scene, they're going to do that preliminary investigation. This may be the first 2 or 3 steps of those core functions. So it may be, first of all, determining what's happened. Was there a crime? Secondly, identifying the perpetrator. And third, perhaps even apprehending the perpetrator if we suspect they're somewhere still in the area. So again, this is usually done by patrol officers. So we usually think of investigations being done by detectives, but to be honest with you, the bulk of investigative work for crimes generally are done by patrol officers, because they're doing that preliminary investigation. And so we hope that we've trained them well enough so they do it well and they don't destroy evidence that might be needed for that last phase, which is prosecuting the perpetrator and providing evidence for that prosecution. We hope that they don't mess up the scene, that they destroy evidence, that they contaminate the scene, that they plant evidence, that they miss evidence, any of these kinds of things. We want to train them so they can do this preliminary investigation even if they aren't detectives, so that they know how to handle a crime scene when they first come upon it, or how to determine if there is even a need to make this a crime scene. The follow-up investigation, this is really where we're talking about maybe the latter functions. So especially the fourth function, which is provide evidence to support a conviction in court. So you want to put a case together, you want to put a file together. It could possibly be identifying and apprehending the perpetrator as well, because maybe the preliminary investigation doesn't reveal the identity of the perpetrator, and so if you don't know who did it, you obviously can't apprehend them. Or even if you did identify who did it, they've escaped, so that may require a follow-up investigation to find them. But this follow-up investigation, the one that's really going to solidify the case, that's the one that's usually done by the detectives. So when the preliminary investigation is completed, then this is when the detectives are going to get more involved. So they may be involved right from the very beginning, so it's obviously a murder case, so let's call in the homicide investigators almost immediately after the body is found or the murder is reported. Or it could be later in the game. It takes a little while maybe for the investigators because it's not a real pressing case. Maybe it's a stolen car, and so this case may languish for quite a while before the detectives even get to it. So again, the timing of it when the detectives come in really depends on the kind of case, how urgent it is, and all these kinds of things. For modern detective work, if we just talk a little bit about the work of detectives, because we've all seen detectives in movies and on TV, and we know what they do, and maybe you've read some Sherlock Holmes, some mystery novels, Agatha Christie, these kinds of things, and you think you know what detectives do, but generally what we see in popular media like books, television, and movie really doesn't correctly and accurately describe what detectives are doing. When did the modern detective really come about? If we look at detectives as being part of police departments, then we can really trace their origins to the mid to late 1800s in England. Because, 1829, we have the first police department in London. By the time we reach the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, police departments are more established, and there's starting to be discussions about, well, maybe we should have individuals who are really trained in understanding the evidence and tracking down criminals who are not immediately apprehended. We need some more sophisticated officers. So as the British police, and especially the London police, were creating the first detective units, some that would eventually go on to be the famous Scotland Yard, there was a lot of debate about where these detectives should come from. And so we're going to get to that. Well, actually, we can talk about it now. As I have here, typically detectives must work first as a patrol officer. And the reason for that is really going back to England in the 1800s as they're developing Scotland Yard. There was a lot of debate as they were discussing and debating how they were going to create these detective units about where those detectives should come from. Should we recruit them from the universities? Now remember, in the 1800s, there aren't that many people going to the university, going to colleges. But there was a lot of thought given and a lot of argument for recruiting detectives from outside police agencies, bringing them in brand new, but bringing them in because they really had a lot more intelligence, a lot more problem solving, critical thinking skills, those kinds of things. But by the time we've reached the 1860s, 1870s, you've had now patrol officers who have moved up through the ranks of the police departments and who are now the chiefs and the middle level managers, and they have a significant amount of control, and they're resisting bringing in outsiders from colleges because as much as Robert Peel wanted the best and brightest to be the first police officers, it was a dirty job. And it was an undesirable job for many people because you were going around in the worst parts of town, the worst parts of the cities, in all kinds of weather and mud and disease and all kinds of other things, dealing with maybe the worst people in the city as well. So it wasn't a real attractive job. Even though it was an important job from the very beginning, it wasn't attractive. So what they actually found in England was they weren't getting many people from the city to sign up for this job. So where did the early police officers come from? Many were from the farms and the mines out in the countryside. Because as bad as the policing job was in the city, it was often a lot better than working on a farm or working in a mine in the 1800s. And so instead of being hired for their brains, often they were hired for their stamina, for their brawn, willingness to work in these bad conditions. And so this is where we see detectives coming in the early phases. And so by the 1860s, they've been in the police department for quite a while, and they're now in somewhat in control of it. So they're the ones who are challenging those experts who want the outsiders, the university scholars, from coming in, because these college graduates may think that they're better than these police officers. So ultimately, the police officers win the battle, and so they convince the powers that be that the best detectives are the ones who have already been police officers. They've served times as patrol officers, so they're going to be the ones best prepared to be detectives. And you know what? We still see that today. In most police departments, if not all, you're going to have to work as a patrol officer for at least a couple years before you can even take the detectives test. Are we losing people who might want to be detectives but don't want to be a patrol officer? Sure. And so you see some agencies that are beginning to rethink this. For instance, the FBI is giving a bigger role to their intelligence analysts, who are people who aren't special agents. They don't carry guns. They don't have arrest powers. But they're really involved in planning out the investigations, the intelligence work, all these kinds of things. And they often have, advanced graduate degrees. I had an FBI friend of mine who said that a lot of these analysts have, double PhDs from Oxford or Cambridge, or wherever. And he said, I don't even know. I know they're speaking English, he said, but they're so far over my head, I don't even understand what they're saying. And so we're giving them a bigger role for some of these analysts, but still, you want to be a detective, you're going to have to work as a police officer. So what do detectives do? Well, actually a wide variety of tasks. So certainly what we always think of with detectives, collecting evidence. But important also is analyzing that evidence. So you may collect the evidence. Here's the gun. Here, should we do some ballistic test? Okay, how do we do those tests? We've got some DNA. How do we analyze it? Those kinds of things. So we may need specialists who understand how to analyze evidence. In addition to, we need people who can collect evidence. If your view of forensics is based on CSI, forget it. That's not real life. Okay, you have specialization. You have people working in labs. You have people that are at crime scenes collecting the evidence, but they're probably not conducting the test. They're not the ones who are interviewing the witnesses. I mean, these are tasks that are broken up among a bunch of different people in different units. Detectives may also do undercover work. So narcotics officers, they may be detectives and they're going to go out and do undercover work, or maybe they're in the organized crime unit, they're going to do undercover. So we often don't think about that, but detectives may be doing undercover work as well. Testifying, they need to be able to communicate their findings and show that they used sound procedures and methods to actually come to these conclusions. So this is especially a problem with as more scientific evidence is coming into courtrooms. Is that evidence as reliable as we think? Sometimes we think just because somebody in a white lab coat who looks like a scientist has said something that it has to be true. Not necessarily. We've found that even though we always thought the fingerprints were unique, sometimes there are matching fingerprints. And so sometimes we mess it up. In DNA, we've messed up DNA results. We can have all kinds of problems in collection and analysis. So we really need to test as we develop new methods to try to identify criminals and to analyze evidence. We need to make sure that they've been rigorously tested and they're actually reliable and valid for producing the conclusions that we've arrived at. Paperwork. This is one of the biggest functions of detectives. Your book talks about them. They could probably be labeled as bureaucrats or administrators, and they might not like that, but so much of their work is paperwork. And you don't see that in the movies, and you don't see that on TV. The forensic sciences, as I said, we have to constantly question whether these new methods that we're coming up with to analyze evidence, are they really reliable? Are they really effective? Are they really as good as we think they are? And also we have to deal with juries now who almost, because of TV, expect that every case will have DNA. Every case will have some CSI kind of evidence. When in fact, in most cases, it's not necessary. So it's almost as if we might have juries that say, hey, if they don't have they don't dazzle us with CSI, this person must be not guilty. Even though we may have some very solid eyewitness testimony, other kinds of evidence, traditional evidence. So, forensic science has certainly advanced crime solving techniques, has advanced our ability to solve crimes, but it also has its problems that we need to be aware of. Finally, as the book pointed out, detectives often have a low likelihood of solving crimes unless the identity of the perpetrator is known or readily discernible. We discussed this before. So as much as we think that detectives can solve every crime, the truth is often they can't. If they don't already know the identity of the perpetrator, or if they don't have a really good description, the chances of solving the crime, even with forensic science, is often pretty low. Finally, intelligence. Intelligence, and so this isn't just tied to detectives, but this is some more of the investigative function. Especially in the post 9/11 world, intelligence is becoming even more important with crime, with law enforcement, both international and domestic. But intelligence is really data plus analysis. We need both. We need to collect the information, but we need to analyze it too. Sometimes people forget that. They think intelligence is only gathering information. But you need people to figure out, well, what does this information really mean? So, as I said, with the war on terrorism, we found that there's greater need for intelligence. For instance, the FBI said they want to be the premier intelligence gathering agency and analytical agency in the world. So they want to be the top intelligence agency. So they've hired a lot of analysts. So these are not necessarily special agents who have enforcement powers, but these are specialists who are hired on who maybe have advanced degrees in political science, history, the sciences, the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. So they bring these folks in, cyber experts who know all about computers, these kinds of things. So the FBI has certainly expanded the role for analyst. Torture, most intelligence experts, I know a lot of FBI agents, and they all condemn torture. We have to ask, is it moral? And so we can debate that. Should we ever torture anybody? There's always the ticking bomb problem. We'll talk more about this when we cover ethics in policing later. But we have to question, first of all, is it moral? So even if it works, should we do it? But then, oftentimes we skip right to that morality question when we don't ask first, which is a more fundamental question, does torture even work? And most experts will say, who are really good at intelligence gathering and analysis, will say torture is not effective. It produces more bad information than good information. So most experts will say we should be against torture. And again, we're going to cover this in later chapters. We'll talk about the effectiveness and the morality of it. Intelligence analysts need very strong critical thinking skills. I have a friend who teaches intelligence analysts for the FBI, and he was constantly getting them more and more advanced training, and they weren't producing better results. So he realized it's not a problem with the roof of the house, it's a problem with the basement, meaning the foundation. They don't have good critical thinking skills. They don't know how to put 2 and 2 together to get 4. Or sometimes it's 2 plus 1 minus 3 plus 7 minus 6, whatever. You've got to go through a bunch of different smoke screens to get to the real information. And they don't have the expertise or the skills to do it. So we need to train them, if possible, to have those skills. And we need to recruit people with strong skills. We often need intelligence agencies with strong networking relationships. They need to be able to, especially if we're talking about international terrorism, be able to call on experts from around the world who they can trust and get information from them, and to work with various other governmental agencies. And we need better ways to sift through mountains of information. Everybody thinks we need more information. We need to give the FBI more ways to conduct surveillance, to tap into phone lines, to tap into computers and those things. And most of my FBI agents friends said, we have way too much information. We need a better way to sift through it and to sort the bad information from the stuff that we really need. Because there's a whole lot more garbage than there is gems. It's looking for that needle in the haystack. So, when we had the school shooting and there had been reports to the FBI about that there was a problem with the school shooter in Florida, as much as we hate to acknowledge it, yeah, the FBI is going to study and see what they did wrong. They get lots of these reports every week, and they don't have the manpower to investigate every single one. And so most of them produce nothing. That school shooter never becomes a school shooter. But when it does, then the FBI is sitting there looking really bad, and people are wondering, why didn't you find it? Well, when you've got a mountain of information and you've got to find that needle that's in that mountain of hay. And that's the real problem most of the time. Because if you're talking about terrorism, terrorists are going to be smart enough that they're going to produce a bunch of false leads, and they're going to lead you all over the place on wild goose chases, and you need to be able to identify that and find what's real and what's important. So we use a lot of algorithms now, a lot of science, a lot of artificial intelligence, and critical assessment to really help us sift through all this information. We still need to perfect it and make it even better.